Well, hello everyone. Here we are, another short lecture series on the age of European expansion. This is principally the two Iberian states in the 15th century that will lead Europeans into reaching out and embracing other parts of the world. That's putting it mildly, putting it gently. This is the beginning of European imperialism and exploitation of other parts of the world. There are very few terms that we can use in this context that are not loaded in some way. So we have to be careful, whether negative or positive. The age of discovery is one way that we can classically talk about this. Well, who's discovering what and who needs to be discovered? And it's Europeans that are discovering other things about the world that were already known to inhabitants of other parts of the world. That's one aspect of it. A second one is that any topic that addresses the age of discovery also should, especially in a world history context, let's say, address the fact that the Chinese are exploring this time, that there are Polynesians who are expanding prior to and during this time. There are even tentative expeditions that we have records of from Africa crossing the Atlantic Ocean unsuccessfully. Well, in the sense that we don't have any record. We assume that those voyages met with um, a less than positive end. So this is a time when the different parts of the globe are actually reaching out and expanding their horizons to other aspects of the globe. Our focus, of course, in a European history course is how Europe is doing it. It's a very charged topic. There are lots of terms that are used for this that can be both positive and negative. Again, because this is something that leads us to the European colonization and imperialism and the negative aspects that come along with that, we have to be very careful about how we even approach these topics. Suffice it to say, let's look at some trends, the conditions and motives that really that compelled Europeans into this position, especially those in southwestern Europe. The traditional explanation for motive of the Age of Exploration is the three G's: God, glory, and gold. And that's, I think, helpful as a primer on the Age of Exploration. But it's a gross oversimplification of the types of things that were going on in Europe, especially during the Middle Ages, that established the grounds by which Europeans were going to reach out. First of all, revival of trade and urban life. This happens during that Crusader moment. Products that were available in the ancient and medieval Near East are kind of reintroduced to Western markets, which were kind of in a way commodity poor. Or to put that in a more positive light, the nature of Western European feudalism was such that it created very self-sustaining communities, small communities. So feudalism and the manor system developed a stable agricultural base for those regions, something that was lacking, let's say, in the late Roman Empire, that caused the disintegration of the Roman Empire in the West. It's one reason for one explanation for it. Those issues had in many ways been resolved over the course of the Middle Ages. And so that we have a Western Europe now that can at least feed itself for the most part. The advent of the plague and the demographic crisis that triggers actually eases food supplies for a short period of time, but by about 1550 again, the expanding European population is again going to put pressure on available food supplies. Nevertheless, that was like a series of microeconomies that were vaguely connected by fairs, traveling merchants, and so forth. Well, the advent of the Crusades now is connecting Europeans in with the products, some coming from even much further afield than the Middle East. A thirst for what we might call luxury goods, incense, fruits, sugar, mostly table type, eating spices and foods and so forth, is really what's of great interest. Pepper, a huge trade in pepper. But these are the types of things that Europeans are developing a taste for, shall we say. Another condition that we can look at is this new alliance that's being formed between the monarchs and the wealthy merchant bankers. Remember, that was something that monarchs needed to get around the sort of entrenched position of the nobility. They needed access to wealth in order to create centralized states, to create armies that could fight for a national, okay, or at least royalist army, as opposed to relying on individual nobles to provide that. And in part, that really creates this strong relationship between the top tier of the peasantry, the wealthy merchants and bankers, they'd be considered peasants, and those monarchs, okay, that end run around the aristocracy. Okay? That's another important condition for the European expansion. There is the struggle for Islam, over naval supremacy in the Mediterranean. This was effectively won by Europeans, particularly by Italian, shall we say, Italian navies, Italian mercenary navies, really, at the disposal, in many cases, of the Spanish royal family. So one of the principal actors in this is going to be Ferdinand and Isabella. Ferdinand of Aragon. It has a Mediterranean empire that stretches from the territory of Aragon in northeastern Spain, through the Balearic Islands to Sicily, to southern Italy, to even parts of North Africa. And he relies very heavily on trade to generate wealth and supplement his naval power with the Genoese in particular. So, and in the other end of the Mediterranean, the Venetians are going to be very, very critical in establishing naval supremacy there. It's in many ways, it's the Venetians who deal one of the last blows to the Byzantine Empire in the Fourth Crusade in 1204. After that, Byzantium is a hodgepodge of, in a sense, a different type of crusader states where Western Europeans are controlling different areas. Venetians and Genoese in the 14th century have a monopoly on trade, which they take over from the Byzantines themselves and manage the trade of the Eastern Mediterranean. It's not really until the rise of the Turks that those Italian navies are challenged in any way. And by the late 1500s, under Spanish coordination and with Spanish financing, those Italian navies under Andre Doria and other mercenary captains like him actually defeat or at least deal a serious setback to the Turkish navy at the Battle of Ponto in 1571. So that all being said, there is this fierce competition navally, and this leads to the development of the development of naval technology, which is critical to overseas exploration. And finally, the Renaissance era is a time of intellectual curiosity about the world around them. So, Europeans are interested in broadening their horizons. Recapping some of what I just said, the Italian merchants are dominating the trade routes, the Venetians and the Genoese, particularly after 1300, but even for quite some time before that. The Spanish and the Portuguese on the Iberian Peninsula have a much less significant share of that trade, that monopoly of what are called the rich trades, the trade in the luxury spices, the small volume, high price goods coming from the Middle East. We contrast that with the so-called bulk trades of the northern northern European cities, of the Baltic and the North Sea cities that are trading largely in grain, so high volume, low price. We're talking here in the Mediterranean, low volume, high price. The Spanish and the Portuguese don't have much to do with that. So they have to look for other ways to generate uh, profit from trade. At the same time, both Spain and Portugal are engaged in warfare with North Africa in particular, but even much closer to home in Iberia itself. It's under Ferdinand and Isabella that in the middle of the 15th century, towards the end of the 15th century, really the Reconquista is completed. 1492 is a very important year in many regards in Spanish history. So there's a great interest in Iberia for exploring new routes because these states need access to other points of trade, other markets, new markets. In some cases, old markets, beyond the reach, beyond the Middle East, to, in a sense, get to the places where the spices, the incense, the fine cloth, and so forth are actually produced, or closer to where they're produced, purchase them there, and then bring them back to Europe for sale. Portugal leads the way in this. Its position in Iberia is natural, faces the Atlantic Ocean, long coastline, and so a tradition develops. The conflicts with Muslim states in North Africa give the Portuguese a North African city that's strategically important on the Moroccan coast. And there is a degree of royal patronage here as well. Prince Henry the Navigator, as he's so called, was instrumental in directing this kind of warfare and developing a school that would encourage Portuguese naval prowess. Interestingly enough, Henry himself was not a navigator. He was not a seaman at all. He just simply was the royal patron responsible for encouraging the development of the Portuguese Navy. There are any number of new technological developments, navigational charts, compasses, astrolabes, a new type of ship, the caravel, that employed two types of sail, the lateen, which is a triangular shaped sail, and rectangular sails for tacking against the wind, for sailing in open waters. Remember, this is quite different from, let's say, what Italian merchants would use, or what even some Spanish merchants would use in the Mediterranean, where trade winds are kind of iffy, and you need ships that are oared ships that you can sail when there aren't really trade winds to rely on, and in more coastal, shallow waters. And a lot of Mediterranean trade tended to hug the coastlines a little bit rather than going out into the central Mediterranean. The discovery of the prevailing winds in the central Atlantic really fosters this. Okay, much in the same way that the discovery of the monsoon winds in the Indian Ocean will allow for both Europeans, but even before that, for Indian traders to capitalize on those prevailing winds. And we've already mentioned the navigational school under Prince Henry. The Portuguese Atlantic trade is initially driven by the sale of slaves. And they are facilitators of slaves, of the slave trade. So the Portuguese themselves aren't necessarily using slaves, but they're managing the sale and the movement of people where from a labor supply to a labor demand. Okay? This gets into the issue of the nature of slavery in West Africa. Of course, slavery does exist in West Africa. It is the result of inter-African conflict, warfare, in which peace treaties are usually accompanied by exchange of human beings, which can be used for forced labor. However, the kind of chattel slavery that we will know in the later 16th and 17th and 18th into the 19th century is not so common during this time period. So we have to be very careful about how we understand what slavery is in this very early time. Other Portuguese who are responsible for exploration during this time: Dias, who reaches the tip of Africa, by the late 1480s, and da Gama, who finally reaches India in the late 1490s. This is really critical because India is the access point, right, for all the peppers and the other types of spices, the cotton cloth, the Indian printed cotton textiles, the Chinese silks are going to make it there as well. So the Portuguese base at Goa is going to be so very, very important in facilitating that trade. Also, we should mention Cabral, who is sailing westward to take the trade winds and kind of inadvertently discover South America by 1500, the Brazilian part of it, and that will lead to the establishment of a Portuguese colony in South America as well, and the later development of Portuguese sugar plantations in South America. Spanish exploration, this story is so familiar to us. It is really spearheaded by Christopher Columbus, the Genoese navigator who finally won backing from Ferdinand and Isabel of Spain. He was a student of navigation. He knew very well of the Greek and Arabic calculations that had been preserved, that were well known to people. You know, Columbus was under no delusion that the earth was flat and that if you sailed far enough west, you'd fall off. He knew better than that. Um, However, those old calculations were inaccurate. And based upon that, Columbus determined that Japan was only about 2,500 miles from the Canary Islands, which were a pretty significant outpost of Spain, as the Azores and the Cape Verde Islands were for the Portuguese. But after 2 months of sailing, instead of reaching Japan, Columbus reaches the Caribbean, which he thinks, looks an awful lot like a chain of islands. That's what he anticipated landing on, off the coast of Asia. So he calls it the Indies. He thought he was in the East Indies. Of course, for three more expeditions, and this did not correct Columbus's understanding. It was not until later cartographers, particularly Amerigo Vespucci, who finally said, well, Chris made a great discovery, but alas, he didn't quite know what he had discovered. Here we see a map of those voyages of Columbus, exploring not only the islands of the Caribbean, but also the coast of Central America and even northern South America. Eventually, Columbus, of course, is made a governor of the Spanish colony on Hispaniola. He is a great navigator. He is less wise when it comes to what he had discovered, and he was lacking in all skill when it came to actually managing a colony. He was such a miserable colonial ruler that they eventually had to recall him to Spain because of this kind of treatment that he allowed and even inflicted on the native populations in the Caribbean. Conflict eventually emerges between Spain and Portugal as to who has access to these new territories. They're all claimed in the name of a particular crown. And so here we have a little bit of national competition going on between Spain and Portugal. So these two very Catholic countries require, in 1494, the intervention of the Pope, who drew up a plan to divide the globe essentially between Spain and Portugal. This is generally called the Treaty of Tordesillas. It creates a line of demarcation that really was drawn right down the Atlantic Ocean, so that everything west of the line was essentially Spanish. Everything east of it, on the African side of it, was going to be Portuguese territory. However, this had to be adjusted because the Portuguese said, well, wait a minute, we already have a claim on Brazil, which is to the west of the line, so there is a slight negotiation to move that a little bit further westward to include those Portuguese claims. The Spanish will have to be very creative because, of course, the way this is set up, The East Indies, therefore, are all Portuguese territory. How did the Spanish now get into the East Indies trade, which is the whole reason why Columbus set sail to the west anyway? He didn't want to get to North America. He wanted to get to the East Indies. So the Spanish are going to have to be somewhat creative in terms of how they deal with that. Here's the line of demarcation. We can see the two periods here, the 1493 line versus the 1494 line, which is further west here, allowing the Portuguese to exploit their claim on Brazil. And here's how the Spanish essentially get around their little conundrum with the East Indies. In order to claim that land, they had to prove that you could go west of the treaty line and get to the East Indies, right? They are simply claiming territory to the west of their line. They prove this when over a series of voyages, for instance, Balboa, who crosses over Panama, sights the Pacific Ocean, which is called the Southern Sea. Magellan, sailing in 1519, finally completes the sailing around South America and into the Pacific. He, of course, is killed in the East Indies. He finally does reach it. He finally is the one who's able to sail west, through, of course, the very circuitous route of going around South America. He finally gets to the East Indies. He's killed there, but his voyage proves that you can sail west, get to China and Southeast Asia and Japan that way, and thus the Spanish are able to claim that archipelago of islands in the Western Pacific that we today call the Philippines, that allow them to engage in that important trade in the East Indies that they so desperately wanted. And this, of course, this was much to the irritation of the Portuguese, who figured that, well, now there's a cuckoo in the nest. The Spanish are going to be now involved in a trade that the Portuguese thought was sort of all their own. Throughout most of its history, though, to be perfectly honest, the Philippines plays a somewhat important role, but the intensive colonization of the Philippines is kind of lacking. It's not the same kind of intensive colonization and establishment of cultural dominance, hegemony, economic exploitation, and so forth that we see in the Spanish North and South American colonies. The Philippines essentially functions as a kind of a trade outpost. So the Manila galleon will sail with the riches accumulated in the East, will sail to the west coast of Mexico. It'll be transported, the goods will be transported overland, and then to Havana, and from Havana in Cuba back to Spain. So there is that importance of the trade across the Pacific Ocean, but compared to what the Spanish will get out of their own New World colonies, it will be less significant. And we can see here the voyage of the voyage of Magellan, sailing southward along the coast of South America, off into the Pacific, and reaching the Philippines, where Columbus dies, and the remainder of the voyage is taken under his second in command, Elcano, and then back to Spain. So that's important there in establishing that Spanish claim to trade in the Pacific Ocean. All right, well, that gives us a general overview of what was going on, why it was happening. We'll talk a little bit about other European countries, France, England, the Dutch, at a later time, and their voyages of exploration, particularly in North America. The Dutch challenge to Portuguese dominance. In many ways, the Dutch are a scavenger empire. That's how I think of them. So if the Portuguese establish their bases in Indonesia, the Dutch will come along and militarily take over them and replace Portuguese colonial control over trade with Dutch control over trade. So the Dutch are a little bit later. Militarily, they're able to outgun the Portuguese, and that will establish the ascendancy, at least for a period of time in the late 16th and throughout much of the 17th century, of a Dutch global trade empire. And of course, the English will catch up even further along after that. But for now, I thank you for listening and have a wonderful day.